When people talk about the Great Depression, they usually talk about the stock market, bank failures, unemployment lines, and men selling apples on street corners. But for most families, the depression was not experienced as a chart or a headline. It was experienced at the kitchen table. It was the moment a mother opened the cupboard and had to decide whether a handful of potatoes could become dinner for 5 people. It was a father pretending he was not hungry so the children could have a little more. It was stale bread saved in a tin, bacon grease kept in a jar, and the coffee stretched so thin it barely deserved the name. The Great Depression did not create one single American diet. A farm family in Oklahoma, an immigrant family in New York, a coal miners family in West Virginia, and a middle-class family that had just lost its savings did not all eat the same food, but they were all learning the same lesson. Food was no longer just about what tasted good, it was about what could last, what could stretch, and what could make people feel like they still had some control over their lives. This is the story of what Americans ate to survive the Great Depression, and it starts, as many depression meals did, with bread. For a lot of families, bread was not a side dish. It was the thing holding the whole meal together. If there was soup, bread made it more filling. If there was gravy, bread gave it somewhere to go. If there was almost nothing, bread with a little butter, lard, molasses, or drippings could still be called breakfast. That sounds simple, but in the early 1930s, simple was exactly the point. When jobs disappeared, meals had to become predictable. Bread was cheap, familiar, and easy to understand. It did not require imagination from a tired parent. It could be eaten fresh, toasted when it got old, soaked into milk, fried in fat, crumbled into soup, or turned into pudding if there was a little sugar around. One of the quiet skills of depression cooking was refusing to let anything become waste. A stale loaf was not trash. It was tomorrow's breakfast, a thickener for meatloaf, a base for dressing, or the beginning of bread pudding. That is the part modern people sometimes miss. Depression cooking was not always about inventing strange recipes. Much of the time, it was about taking ordinary food and making it do one more job before it disappeared. If you had bread, you had options. If you had no bread, the kitchen suddenly felt much emptier. And in cities, that is why bread lines became one of the lasting images of the period. Men did not stand in those lines because the food was special. They stood there because a piece of bread could mean the difference between getting through the day and having nothing at all. Soup may be the most depression era food of all. Not because it was glamorous, but because it was flexible. A pot of soup could forgive almost anything. Too little meat, add more water. Only a few vegetables, cut them smaller beans. Taking up most of the pot, that was fine. Soup was not there to impress anyone. It was there to turn fragments into a meal. In homes, soup often started with whatever was available. A bone from a previous dinner, a few carrots, an onion, cabbage, potatoes, beans, or yesterday's leftovers. If there was pasta or rice, that could go in too. A little flour could thicken it. A little fat could make it feel richer than it was. In public relief kitchens, soup made sense for the same reason. It could be prepared in large quantities, served quickly, and adjusted depending on what ingredients had been donated or purchased cheap. That image of men waiting outside the soup kitchens became one of the defining scenes of the Depression because it showed hunger becoming public. Before the Depression, many families had been poor, but poverty was often hidden inside homes, farms, boarding houses, and immigrant neighborhoods. During the 1930s, hunger moved into the street. People lined up where others could see them. For many men who had grown up believing that work and dignity were tied together, standing in a food line was humiliating. The food helped. It kept people alive, but it also reminded them of what they had lost. That is why depression soup has two meanings. At home, it was resourcefulness. In a bread line, it was relief mixed with shame. IF bread was the first line of defense. Potatoes were the workhorse. They were cheap, filling, and forgiving. You could boil them, fry them, mash them, bake them, or stretch them with onions. They could become breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what else was in the house. One of the classic Depression-style meals people still talk about is fried potatoes with onions, sometimes with a little hot dog, sausage, or leftover meat if the family had it. It was not fancy, but it made sense. Potatoes gave bulk, onions gave flavor. A small amount of meat, sliced thin enough, could make the whole pan smell more satisfying than the budget should have allowed. That was an important trick. During hard times, meat often became more of a seasoning than the center of the plate. A family might not have enough pork, beef, or sausage for everyone to get a full portion, but a little bit of it could flavor beans, soup, cabbage, potatoes, or gravy. This changed the role of meat in the meal. Instead of asking, "How much meat can we serve?" families often ask, "How many people can this little piece of meat help feed?" Potatoes were useful because they accepted that arrangement. They did not compete with meat. They stretched it. You can imagine a pan on the stove, sliced potatoes browning slowly in fat, onions getting soft at the edges, maybe a few rounds of hot dog mixed in near the end. A meal like that probably did not feel like a history to the people eating it. It felt like a Tuesday night. But that is exactly why it matters. Survival food is usually not dramatic while it is happening. It is ordinary food under pressure. Beans were one of the great survival foods of the Depression. They were inexpensive, shelf-stable, filling, and nutritious enough to carry a meal without meat. A bag of dry beans could sit in the pantry until someone had time to soak and cook them. Once cooked, they could become soup, stew, beans on toast, beans with cornbread, or a simple pot that lasted more than one meal. For rural families, beans were often part of a larger pattern of self-reliance. If they had land, even a small garden, they could grow some of what they ate. If they had jars, they could can vegetables. If they had chickens, they might have eggs. If they had a cow, they might have milk. That did not mean rural life was easy. During the Depression, many farmers were also losing land, income, and crops. The Dust Bowl made things even worse in parts of the plains, where drought and poor farming practices helped turn farmland into dust. Still, the rural poor sometimes had one advantage over the urban poor: they were closer to food production. In a city, losing a job could mean losing access to food almost immediately. In the country, a family might still be poor, but if the garden survived, if the hens kept laying, if the cellar had jars from last season, there was at least something to work with. Beans fit both worlds. In cities, they were cheap. In the country, they were practical. In both places, they gave people a way to eat without depending too much on meat. And unlike some Depression foods that feel strange to modern viewers, beans still make complete sense today. A pot of beans does what it has always done. It turns time, water, salt, and patience into dinner. The Depression kitchen loved foods that could be cooked soft, served hot, and stretched across the day. Cornmeal and oatmeal were perfect for that. Oatmeal could be breakfast when there was little else. It was warm, plain, and cheap. Add milk if you had it, sugar if you were lucky, or just salt if that was all the budget allowed. It filled the stomach without pretending to be exciting. Cornmeal was even more versatile. It could become cornbread, fried mush, grits, or a simple porridge. In many households, especially in the South and rural areas, cornmeal was not Depression food in the sense of being new. It was old food that became even more important when money got tight. Fried cornmeal mush is a good example of how Depression cooking often worked. First, you cook cornmeal with water into a thick porridge. You eat some of it hot. Then you pour the rest into a pan and let it cool until it firms up. The next day, you slice it and fry it in a little fat. Suddenly, yesterday's plain mush becomes something with crisp edges and a softer middle. That is not just thrift, that is kitchen intelligence. The same ingredient had two lives. The first life was soft and filling. The second life was fried and a little more satisfying. A lot of depression cooking followed that pattern. Cook once, eat twice, save the fat, keep the scraps. Turn leftovers into something that does not feel exactly like leftovers. It was not always delicious, but it was clever. And the clever mattered. Not every depression meal was built from total emptiness. Sometimes the problem was more frustrating. The family had food, but not enough of the right food. Maybe there was milk, but not much bread. Maybe there were eggs, but not enough for everyone to have two. Maybe there was flour, but no butter. Maybe there was a little meat, but no vegetables. Cooking became a daily negotiation with scarcity. Eggs were valuable because they could make a dish feel complete. One egg could enrich soup, bind a batter, stretch a casserole, or be scrambled with potatoes and onions. In a family with backyard chickens, eggs could be the difference between plain starch and something closer to a meal. Milk had a similar role. Milk toast, creamed vegetables, white sauce, and simple puddings all came from the idea that milk could soften, thicken, and comfort. But milk and eggs were not a guarantee. For many families, they were precious enough to be used carefully. A cake that required butter, eggs, and milk might feel impossible. That is why recipes remembered as depression cake, crazy cake, or wacky cake became so meaningful. They show that a sweet could be made with flour, sugar, cocoa, oil, vinegar, baking soda, and water without depending on dairy or eggs. Some versions became especially associated with wartime rationing. But the appeal came from the same hard times logic. Make something comforting without the ingredients people could not separate. That kind of dessert tells you something important about survival. People did not only need calories, they also needed small reminders that life had not become entirely great. A cheap cake was not going to fix unemployment or save the farm. But for one evening, it could make a kitchen smell like something good was happening. Modern American meals often put meat at the center. During the Depression, many families could not afford to think that way. Instead, the meat was stretched, hidden, chopped, mixed, or replaced. A small amount of ground meat could become meatloaf if you added bread crumbs, oats, onions, or crackers. A ham bone could flavor beans. Bacon grease could make potatoes taste richer even when there was no bacon left. Hot dogs could be sliced into a pot of macaroni or fried with potatoes so that every person got a little taste. This is where some of the famous Depression-style dishes come from. One-pot meals with pasta, canned tomatoes, corn, beans, and a small amount of cheap meat. Some people remember these kinds of dishes under names like Hoover stew. The recipes varied, and the name itself carried a political insult toward President Herbert Hoover. What matters is not one official recipe. There probably was not one. What matters is the technique. Take something cheap and starchy. Add something canned if you have it. Add a small amount of meat if possible. Cook everything together so the flavors mix and nobody can easily measure who got more. That last part is important. A stew can hide inequality inside the pot. If one child gets less meat than another, it is harder to notice. If the family is eating sliced meat on plates, scarcity is obvious. In a stew, everyone receives the same ladle, and the meal feels a little fairer. That may sound small, but family under pressure notice small things. Dinner is not just about nutrition. It is also about avoiding the feeling that there is not enough love to go around. For families with access to land, the garden became one of the most important survival tools. A garden could produce potatoes, beans, cabbage, tomatoes, onions, greens, squash, and other vegetables that could be eaten fresh or preserved. Canning was essential. A shelf of jars in the cellar meant a family had some defense against winter, unemployment, and bad luck. This was not romantic hobby gardening, it was work. Someone had to plant, weed, harvest, wash jars, boil water, watch for spoilage, and plan months ahead. Women often carry much of that labor, along with cooking, sewing, budgeting, and trying to keep children fed. The garden also changed the emotional experience of the depression. When food came from the ground, a family had at least some sense of agency. They might not control the banks, the weather, or the job market, but they could control a row of beans or a pot of tomatoes if conditions allowed. In cities, people found other ways to improvise. Some kept small gardens in yards or vacant lots. Some relied on relatives in the country. Some bought the cheapest produce near closing time. Some foraged when they could. The Depression made Americans think carefully about where food came from. It also exposed a strange contradiction. The country could produce enormous amounts of food, yet millions of people still went hungry because they had no money to buy it. That contradiction eventually became part of federal food policy. One of the cruelest parts of the Great Depression was that hunger existed alongside agricultural surplus. Farm prices had collapsed. Farmers were struggling. At the same time, unemployed city families could not afford enough food. The system had food in one place and need in another, but it did not automatically know how to connect them. The first federal food stamp program, launched in 1939, was designed to help bridge that gap. People on relief could buy orange stamps for their normal food purchases and receive extra blue stamps that could be used for foods designated as surplus. The details may sound bureaucratic, but behind them was a simple problem. America had the food, and America had hungry people, but the market was failing to bring those two things together. That detail matters because it shows how hunger during the Depression was not simply about a lack of food. It was about access. The country had farms, warehouses, trucks, stores, and families who needed food. But without wages, purchasing power, and distribution systems, food could still fail to reach the people who needed it most. For a family standing in a grocery store with almost no money, abundance was almost insulting. Food could be right there on the shelf and still feel unreachable. That is one reason Depression food carried such emotional weight. It was not only about empty fields or empty cupboards. Sometimes it was about seeing food and knowing you could not buy it. Not every hungry family looked hungry. Some families had been comfortable before the crash. They had dishes, tablecloths, recipes, manners, and ideas about what dinner was supposed to look like. Then the bank failed, the job disappeared, or the savings ran out. For these families, depression, cooking often involved trying to preserve normal life with cheaper ingredients. A casserole could look respectable even when it was mostly noodles. A white sauce could make leftovers seem intentional. A moldy salad, a simple pudding, or a carefully sliced loaf could make a poor meal feel organized. That is something worth remembering. People were not only trying to feed their bodies, they were trying to protect their dignity. A mother might serve a very cheap meal, but she could still set the table. She could still call it supper. She could still make sure the children washed their hands. Those rituals mattered because they kept poverty from taking over the whole house. Food was one of the last places where a family could pretend, even briefly, that life was still under control. Adults often remember depression food as worry. Children sometimes remember it as flavor. A child might not fully understand why the meal was mostly potatoes, why the soup had more water than usual, or why dessert only appeared once in a while. What they remember was the smell of frying onions, the comfort of cornbread, the sweetness of molasses, or the rare excitement of cake. That does not mean childhood hunger was harmless. Many children suffered badly during the Depression, but memory is complicated. The same meal that represented failure to a parent could represent warmth to a child. This is why depression recipes still survive in families. Some people make them because they are cheap. Others make them because a grandmother made them. A dish that began as necessity can become nostalgia after enough time has passed. That transformation is not unusual in food history. Many beloved foods begin as poor people's solutions. Beans, stews, dumplings, cornbread, noodle dishes, fried leftovers. Later, people remember them as tradition, but during the Depression, the people cooking those meals were not trying to create heritage. They were trying to get through the week. By the time the United States moved toward World War II, the food story began to change. Jobs came back for many people through defense production. Rationing created a new kind of food discipline. Government programs expanded. The country did not forget hunger, but the national mood shifted. Still, the Depression left marks on American kitchens. It taught people to save fat in jars. It taught them not to waste the bread. It made casseroles, one-pot meals, canned goods, and budget cooking feel normal. It strengthened the idea that a good home cook was not just someone who made food taste good, but someone who could make food stretch. That lesson was especially pushed onto women. A housewife was expected to manage scarcity almost like a magician, keep the family fed, spend less money, waste nothing, and somehow make the table feel comforting. That expectation could be unfair, but it also produced a real skill. Depression cooking was practical, emotional, and deeply creative. It was not the creativity of luxury restaurants. It was the creativity of limits. Anyone can make a good meal with a full pantry. The harder question is what you do with the flour, potatoes, onions, beans, a little fat, and a family waiting at the table. For millions of Americans in the 1930s, that was not a cooking challenge. That was life. So, what did Americans eat to survive the Great Depression? They ate bread that was never allowed to go to waste. They ate soup that could be stretched with water and patience. They ate beans, potatoes, cornmeal, oatmeal, cabbage, onions, and whatever meat could be sliced thin enough to flavor a whole pot. They ate from gardens, from relief kitchens, from lunch counters, from jars in the cellar, and from recipes that ask less from the pantry than people wished they had. But the real answer is a little deeper than a grocery list. Americans ate food that helped them keep going when the normal promises of life had broken down. A job was no longer guaranteed. Savings could vanish. A farm could fail. A city could be full of food and still leave people hungry. In that world, a meal did not have to be beautiful to matter. A bowl of beans mattered. A pan of fried potatoes mattered. A slice of bread with drippings mattered. A cheap cake made without eggs or milk mattered because it reminded people that even in a hard year, a kitchen could still produce something sweet. The Great Depression changed the way Americans thought about food. It made the thrift a virtue, leftovers a strategy, and fullness a kind of relief. And maybe that is why these foods still hold our attention almost a century later. They are not impressive in the usual way. They do not look like a luxury. They do not photograph like restaurant food. But they tell the truth about eating in hard times. Sometimes survival tastes like soup. Sometimes it tastes like potatoes fried in yesterday's grease. And sometimes, if the family was lucky, it tasted like a small piece of cake made from almost nothing. Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoy this deep dive into the culture behind the food we eat, subscribe for more stories like this, and I'll see you in the next one.